In this series, we've been looking at the greatest commandment that Jesus gave us, to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is all about the idea of us worshiping God. We've talked about loving God with all our heart and how our hearts make us feel far away from God when we mess up or do things wrong. We've talked about how worship is about connection and not perfection. Our mistakes don't have to keep us away from God. Despite our sins, we can still draw close thanks to Jesus. We've talked about loving God with your soul, and we said that sometimes the best way to love God with our soul is to rest, which doesn't always come naturally to us. But God designed us to take time, pause, and slow down. And when that happens, it's actually an incredible way to worship God. Today, I want to talk about the idea of loving God with your mind. And before we do that, I want to ask a simple question. Isn't it true that most of us never think about the idea of loving God with our minds? Let me ask another question. Isn't it true that we don't really think about our thinking at all? I mean, think about it. See what I did there? When is the last time you said to yourself, I really need to pay attention to the things I'm allowing my mind to focus on? It's been a while, hasn't it? We have thoughts that fly in and out of our brains every single hour, but we rarely pay attention to the patterns and habits of our thinking. What we do pay attention to, however, are our feelings. For example, when you think about church or a relationship with God, you automatically think of your emotions. You think about how you feel when you sing certain songs that you love. You think about how you feel when you're in a beautiful place and you see God's creation and it makes you think of Him. And this makes sense. But it isn't just true in your relationship with God. Emotions are a big part of our relationship with other people too. Whether it's friends, family members, teammates, or classmates, feelings are a big part of how we gauge relationships in general. You feel like you're totally into the relationships, or you feel like you're totally checked out. You feel like things are going awesome, or you feel like they're falling apart. You feel close and connected, or you feel distant. We are used to making our feelings the measurement of our relationships. In fact, maybe you broke up with someone you were dating, or they broke up with you. And if the breakuppers were honest, they'd admit it was because they fell out of all their feels. No more feels was a sign that it was time to have no more relationship. We put a lot of weight and stock into what our feelings are telling us. But what happens when your feelings send you a bad message? What happens when you mess up? What happens when you have a bad day? What happens when you get into a big argument with your mom or a close friend hurts your feelings? In those moments, we all know how much it can negatively affect our emotions. But what happens next is the silent killer. Our negative emotions lead to a whole lot of negative thinking. We start thinking things like, I'm a terrible person. No one likes me. I'm a loser. We don't believe that we have any control over our thinking or our emotions. They just are what they are. And not only is this dangerous because it gives fuel to our negative emotions, over time it can affect what we believe about God, about ourselves and our lives, about others. Without realizing it, we can write a terrible script for our existence. Most of us have never considered the idea that not only can we control our thoughts, but our thoughts can also control our emotions. Here's the good news, it's not too late to figure this out. If you can change how you think about your thinking, it will have a huge impact on every area of your life, including your relationship with God. With that in mind, we're going to look at a passage today from the book of John. If you've never picked up a Bible and read it before, John is a good place to start. It's one of the 4 books of the New Testament that tells us about Jesus' life on earth. The guy who wrote it, yes, his name was John, was extremely close to Jesus when Jesus was on earth. When we pick up this passage, the scene is set with people who feel confused about who Jesus really is. Jesus talked with authority, saying things like, God is my Father, and I don't belong in this world. He even suggested that he would be killed one day because of who he is. Needless to say, people were confused, so Jesus turned his attention to the people who seemed to believe in him and what he said. And here's the statement that John records. You are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Jesus wanted people to know the truth. Why? Because in truth, there is freedom. We gain freedom by understanding what's real and right in a situation, even when we don't feel like it. So at this point, the natural thing to say is that you and I need to ground our minds in what is true. And through that, we will begin to love God with our minds. This sounds nice. I could even see this on an Instagram quote with the beautiful picture of a snow-covered mountain in the background. And I think most of us would even like a comment like this. That is, if we weren't having a horrible day, if we weren't left out of an outing with our friends, if someone didn't just say something sarcastic about our outfit, if our dad just didn't say we couldn't take the car this Friday night, if we didn't just bomb a calculus test, if we didn't get a rejection letter from the college we applied to, if we didn't look at porn last night, if we didn't have a ridiculous amount of pressure on dominating our schoolwork, if we didn't find out the person we're dating was also talking to someone else. In those moments, telling ourselves to think about truth that sets us free doesn't seem big enough to combat the dominant negative emotions we feel. I mean, isn't it true that when one part of your life feels really bad, your whole life feels bad? With that in mind, let's look at something the Apostle Paul wrote. Paul was an extremely intelligent human being. He grew up studying God and religion. In fact, he was a super student. As an adult, one of his jobs was to protect the religious beliefs of his people. And as you can imagine, Jesus shook a lot of that up. Eventually, Paul went from a man who hated Jesus followers to a devout Jesus follower himself, and he felt like it was his mission in life to take the teachings of Jesus to as many people as possible. The cool thing about Paul is that he did as much of that as he could in person. He loved being face-to-face with people from all types of religious and ethnic backgrounds, and as he interacted with real people, he began to apply the teachings of Jesus to their everyday broken lives. He was the greatest teacher and missionary in the history of Christianity. And Paul talked a lot about our thinking. For example, take this excerpt from a letter he wrote. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Paul doesn't use passive language to talk about the arguments or lies that we think. He tells his readers to demolish them. He tells them to take their thoughts captive, just like an ancient army could take hostages during a war and put them under the watch of a guard or in prison. Paul told his readers to do that with their thoughts. Why? So they could make their thoughts obedient to Christ, which means what? That they are able to then focus on what is true. Because like Jesus said, the truth will set you free. In other words, instead of us being a prisoner to our thoughts, we make them a prisoner to us. Think about the music time during worship at church. Words are often put up on the screen to give us truth to think and sing about. How many times do you find your mind going to all the negative emotions you feel? What if you could put those thoughts and emotions in prison? Put a guard in front of them and focus on the truth that sets you free. Paul says that we have the power to do this. We can not only take negative thoughts captive, we can demolish them. We can not only make our thoughts obedient to Jesus, we can focus on the truth that sets us free. In other words, you can worship God with your mind. But how do we do this? I believe this starts by recognizing the lies we're prone to believe. These are the arguments that Paul tells us to demolish. What is something you've thought about a lot lately that may not be truth? Maybe it's that God doesn't love you, that you've messed up too much, that you're worthless, that nobody cares about you, that you're not smart, cool, or talented, that the people around you are stupid. Demolishing these arguments is all about bringing them to a stop, putting them in jail, and putting a guard in front of them. This may take some time and practice, but you can do it. It may simply start by you saying, I refuse to give any more power to that type of thinking. That thinking stops today in Jesus' name. Next, it's time to focus on the truth that sets you free. What is truth when it comes to what God says about you? God says things like this. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. You, Lord, are forgiving and good, abounding in love to all who call to you. But you, Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. What God says about others? Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Find the argument that you're prone to believe. Put it in jail and find a new truth to focus on instead. It sounds simple, but it won't feel like it when our emotions get involved. In that moment, it will be work. It will be a discipline, but it's a way to worship God and love Him more. The cool thing about this is that it's your choice. You get to decide what to do with your negative thoughts and emotions. You don't have to be a victim to whatever pops up in your mind and stays there. You can focus on truth that sets you free. You can demolish the lies that dominate your thought life. You can make your thoughts obedient to Jesus. You have the power to control where your mind goes. You have the ability to redirect your thinking. In fact, you have the ability to develop a whole new rhythm for your life when it comes to your thinking. Your thought life can move from a helpless random force that has the power to affect your emotions to a discipline that draws you closer to God. You can worship God with your mind.